Here's Carlos. Good morning, Carlos, Jennifer. Nice to have you all. Hi, Sarah. Good to see you. All righty. Good morning. But you're listening to something good over there. I can tell, Doris.
It's all in my head.
It's all in your head. You're just
Trying to add a little levity. It does make a difference when we join with music playing, doesn't it?
It does. It does. Yeah, Trace introduced us to some interesting music at a different task force yesterday. That would have gotten this group going.
Apologies, I just had a full Wi-Fi meltdown. Can you hear me?
You're the party accelerator, Trace.
I'm sorry. You can hear me now, though?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Good
Okay,
morning,
well,
everybody.
yeah, good morning, everybody.
We'll
It was Chapel Roan, Stephanie. That's who it was.
Chapel Roan. I got to write that down again. It was so good.
Yeah, it's the Gen Z YMCA is what everyone is saying.
Actually,
We
I have it
played.
written yesterday still, right there.
Oh, nice. Okay, Jennifer Isle, you seem to know who Chapel Roan is. I saw the head nod. Yeah. She pulled the largest crowd at Lollapalooza in history, and she's just like a brand new little indie artist. So if you don't know her, it's a fun way to stay relevant with youths, I have found.
You think a single song is going to keep me relevant with youth?
I don't know, it could. That's what's working for Kamala Harris right now.
It feels like I need about 20 years of updates before I do that. I'm like a computer. I haven't had updates in a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. How are we doing, Trace?
I think we're good. We're definitely at quorum, so I think just let's go ahead and jump in.
Great. All right. Good morning, everybody. Wonderful to see you all. Can you believe it is August 7th? I repeat, August 7th. So our summer, we have spent the summer together doing really good work, and just thank you for continuing to come and to shine. I am going to go ahead and start with our just our general business. And I'm taking you back in history to July 17. We have 3 documents that we need to approve from that meeting date. Those were contained in your Google Drives, and Trace sent you that link. Beginning first with July 17th, we have one set of general meeting minutes. And so, are there any additions or changes to the general meeting minutes from that date? I see none. I see head shakes no. If I could then please have a motion and a second to approve those meeting minutes from July 17.
I move to approve those minutes.
Thank you.
Second.
Ida was first, and I'm sorry, who was second?
Dawn Alexander.
Thank you, Dawn Alexander. Is there anybody who is not in favor of approving those meeting minutes from July 17? Okay, I see no hands, so we're good to go. Those will be approved. I am flipping now to our meeting recaps from that July 17 meeting. And first, I'm going to start with the meeting recap from the data subcommittee. So this is for you, data friends. Are there any changes that anybody would like to see to that meeting recap from the data subcommittee? I see no one. All right, if we could have a motion then and a second to approve the recap for the data subcommittee.
This is Michelle Dawsey. I'll make that move.
Sarah, I'll second.
Thank you both. All right, is there any objection to the approval of that meeting recap for the data subcommittee? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and approve that document. Our next meeting recap is for our occupational subcommittee friends. Are there any edits to that particular document? And I'm glancing and glancing. I see none. All right. If we could have a motion and a second to approve the meeting recap from the Occupation Subcommittee, please.
This is Tara Dockstader. I move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Tara.
Aletha Jenkins, I second.
Great, thank you, Aletha. Is there anybody who is opposed to the approval then of the meeting recap from the Occupation Subcommittee? All right, I see none. That document will be approved. I am now taking you forward in time to July 24th. We have one set of meeting minutes, general meeting minutes for the group. Are there any changes or additions that need to be made to that document? And this is for the whole group. I see no hands up. Then if we could have again a motion and a second to approve the July 24th general meeting minutes.
I need more coffee. I move that I drink more coffee. I move to pass the minutes for the meeting.
Thank you, Chris.
Don Alexander will second.
Thank you again, Don. All right. Is there anybody who is opposed to approval of the general meeting minutes from July 24th? Okay, I see none. And last but not least, we have a meeting recap from the July 24th meeting. Are there any additions or edits that need to be made to that document? Okay, no head shakes, great. If we could also, again, have a motion and a second to approve our last document.
This is Tara Dockstader. I motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you.
This is Michelle Dossi. I'll second that motion.
Thank you, Michelle. All right. Is there any opposition to the approval then of the July 24th general meeting recap document? Okay, and I see none. So all those documents will be approved. Thank you, Trace. We're good.
All right, thanks. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully my internet is back on. But yeah, appreciate y'all being here. As a reminder, this is a continued discussion from our last meeting of the Specialized Occupations Subcommittee conversation. We had a lot to talk about, and so we realized that we just needed more time. So we will take up as much time as we need within our 3 hours today, and if we finished early, then great. So I just wanted to just be clear that that's our goal today, is to just get through the remaining directives and make sure that that subcommittee feels that they've had the opportunity to present, where they've been and the conversations that have been had. So I want to reground us in a couple of those things, and I'll kind of guide us through this discussion. We've got a few things that we're going to get after today. I'm going to share out the survey results in a little while regarding the legal representation survey that you all took. We did have, I think, 19 folks respond to that. So we do have enough to move forward with the preference there, and I'll share out those results in a bit. The second piece is circling back to this discussion around reporting timeframes for mandatory reporters who are creating the safety plan. And that conversation really hits at Directive 7 and Directive 11 in a little bit of different ways, but we want to make sure that we're able to delineate how it impacts the two. And then we're going to turn it over to Kathy Wells, who looks like, Kathy, thanks, you made it to your office, who's going to really tee up the conversation that the subcommittee had around this notion of medical child abuse and where the subcommittee's kind of landed, and give you all an opportunity to kind of bat that around and make sure that we are able to capture that discussion accordingly. So that's what we have ahead of us today. And if we get in a little deeper, we need a break, we will certainly take that. And please ping me if you feel like we have reached that time and you haven't gotten a break yet. Jordan, anything else that I'm missing as far as discussion wise?
No, I may chime in here and there, just asking for clarification as
Please.
you right and making sure. But other than that, Trace, I think you hit it all.
Great. Okay, cool. So I want to tee us up first with this conversation around reporting timeframes, and I want to recenter us in our directive that first and foremost, when I think about these task forces and when we have specific legislative directives, it's really easy that other things get pulled out of those directives, and then we kind of head off in those directions, which are great conversations, and we will, of course, capture those, and those will be part of our report. But we also want to make sure that legislatively we are meeting our requirements of what we need to answer as a task force. And so I want to just recenter us in this specific directive around reporting timeframes and stick in that for a little bit. And then I know that we've had the conversation around victims advocate removal as a whole. And that is really a separate conversation that we will have to capture in the report. But I want to make sure that we answer specifically this directive because it is the directive that we were given to answer. So in this Directive 7, reporting timeframes for mandatory reporters who are creating a safety plan for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking to ensure the safety of the victim and the victim's family members while creating the plan. So the conversation really centered around on a reporting. So this is kind of where everyone was like, well, we'd like removal altogether. However, if we're looking at the discussion of this directive and the reporting timeframe, the discussion, as I understand it, landed on we are comfortable, and this is also where our survey results are, we are comfortable with a 72-hour delay as it relates to those making these safety plans. And so I just want to put that out there to folks as what we are talking about as the recommendation, which is this number of 72 hours. I want to make sure I just pause there and give folks an opportunity to jump in with any questions, comments, concerns around this time frame piece, and we'll go from there. Jennifer, I'll jump in.
Thanks, Trace. I think for me, there was some confusion around this because I perceive this as an either or. Either there's a delay or we take victim advocates out of the list of mandatory reporters. And I think it's gotten kind of confusing for me. I do not, and I think we had this conversation last time, I don't necessarily believe that everyone who might be working with a survivor of domestic violence, sex assault, or stalking has the skills to create a safety plan and should be delaying reporting. We need a lot more training. We need a lot of things for everyone around these issues. But as a sort of big overarching policy that anyone who's working with a survivor might delay reporting, I'm not sure I agree with that.
Okay. Yeah, and I appreciate that, Jennifer. So just to kind of come to your first point around the difference between the two, there is, as it relates to, like, as we're doing it today, yes, there is a difference that I want to make sure that we sit squarely in the space of the reporting timeframe thing. So with that kind of context, then let's go off of your comments around, okay, if we're sitting squarely, if we're putting on the shelf for a moment the conversation around complete removal of victim advocates and the conversation there and what folks would like to see captured in the report, this reporting timeframes piece, it sounds like you have a concern that if that's what we're talking about, that delay for 72 hours across the board for folks creating safety plans, there's actually concern about allowing that for some folks. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Well, I think, one, we don't have a definition of safety plan. So, what does that mean exactly? And I don't want to, I think it gets too complicated if we say, well, these folks might have enough skill to be actually creating a safety plan and these mandatory reporters don't. I just think that's going to get too murky and too confusing. So I'm having a hard time with trying to say we're going to do both of those things, which is where I think how I think we're talking about this right now. And maybe you could clarify that.
That last comment, both of the things, are you talking about the delay versus removal?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I think I think the conversation's important. Keeping within the scope of what the directive is, I would not respond to this directive thinking that there's an additional recommendation around the removal of victim advocates. I would respond to this directive as it's related specifically to the directive, because I think what that challenges us is that we're then legislatively we're like, well, we're going to do this, and then there might be a recommendation around here. I think we have to put that other conversation on the shelf for now in this moment and respond specifically to this directive as it's legislatively directed, and then we can have the conversation around. And I understand the crossover, and I feel that tension. I totally hear you, but I also want to make sure that we don't say one thing assuming another piece, and then we haven't responded with fidelity to the specific directive. So I'm trying to make sure that we're, does that make sense? Like I get what you're saying, but I also want to make sure that we, yeah. So that's where I'm not trying to like muscle you into like, no, we can't have that conversation. It's just more that let's make sure that we understand fully this directive as it's written, how we want to respond to it, and then we can have that continued discussion. Roshan, with the haircut, I'm loving it. Come on in. I think you're on mute, or I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
Thank you. Yes, this is Roshan. I think, so I was gonna agree with Jen, and I hear you saying maybe that's not what we're talking about in this conversation. In terms of, I do worry that we are underestimating the skill set that's needed to create a safety plan, and we're sort of assuming that anybody with any other kind of skill set can do that same work, when this directive was initially, like, the conversation from the task force was about DV and SA advocates who were still mandatory reporters. And so if we are, so I hear that we're not saying we can't, I hear that we're talking about them as separate things, but this was brought up as a stopgap if we couldn't, in my memory of those early conversations. So I just wanted to reiterate that. The other thing that's coming up for me in the new language here, which from our last conversation, is to ensure the safety of the victim. I don't know how to do that, even as a DV advocate. I mean, none of us can ensure safety, and I don't know if legally that's a concern. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I would want the lawyers to speak, but I wouldn't want there to be any, if we did go forward with this, and I'm thinking of the conversation we had around teachers last time. I mean, safety planning doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work, or that the person actually finds the safety that we want them to have. So anyhow, so I'm just curious about that language, if that puts people in a situation where there's some risk. If they did wait and then something bad happened, is there any risk in the language as it's written here? Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is language from the directive. So I think that the recommendation.
So it doesn't matter.
Right. The recommendation, it doesn't include this language, right? This is
the ensure language isn't in the recommendation.
Well, that's a great question, but the language that I shared in the chat, I just want to clarify.
Is the directive only. Okay, sorry. I may have taken it.
The intent of the directive is to ensure the safety of the victim. I hear you that there was no way to 100% ensure the safety of the victim, so that feels like a challenging directive, but that's the language here. So we can just make a note.
I just wouldn't want any legal language to say that it was somebody's job to ensure safety, was what I was thinking about. But if that's not,
and that's a helpful call out from your perspective, so I can make sure that I'm just saying, Jordan, let's just make a note of that as it relates to the recommendation itself, that we're not.
I'm also just gonna drop the language that was the proposed recommendation we were talking about last time, so you can see the distinction.
Yes.
From the directive language to what we were talking about. Now, we haven't solidified anything, but they're two separate things.
Okay, perfect. So if you drop that in, that's great. Gina, let's come to you. Roshan, is that helpful? Yeah, check out the language from the recommendation. Sorry for the confusion there, and then let us know. All right, Gina, and then Jessica, and then Lori.
Yeah, so I think that also an important nuance to advocates, and I think that's where we're getting confused a lot. And I went back and grabbed where there was a question around, those advocates that work with the prosecutor's office. So the huge difference between what makes a community-based advocate different than, say, an advocate generally, because also defense teams have advocates as well. It's a very confusing situation for victims. Is that the statute that community-based advocates live under here in Colorado, which is that privilege piece that they hold. And for me, as I understood these conversations, is that this applies to those community-based advocates under that statute because they hold a privilege there for what is seemingly adult victims. And what we were hoping for is to align that so that our advocates are not having to kind of work safety planning around mandatory reporting obligations and their privileged relationships with survivors, specifically around young adults, teenagers. And so that's where I think we're getting lost in a lot of it in terms of that. Prosecutors or law enforcement advocates are system-based advocates who are mandatory reporters regardless. They can also be conducting safety plans with folks. But in my experience, a lot of times those folks, that's where the handoff happens in collaboration and partnerships with community-based resources. It's because community-based advocates hold a lot more flexibility, not just capacity and time-wise and in relationships, but also around kind of how they hold a different way to kind of do referrals. They do a great work to kind of help the best that they can to protect the privacy of victims who are seeking services around safety planning and what those other partners could do to help that. And so a lot of times system advocates, in my experience, hand those things over to community-based programs and advocates to handle safety planning in terms of like that more comprehensively. Because for system-based advocates, they have to, not always, but they have to disclose that things that they share are reportable, because lots of times victims are in crisis and they will share aspects of their victimization that may not paint them in the best of lights, which is why community-based advocates, part of our training when we disclose what our relationship is going to be with a victim is that depending on their age, right now, this is kind of how we have to direct advocates is depending on your age, I may not be able to hold privilege with you like I would for somebody who is considered an adult here in Colorado. So I have to, in our initial meeting and conversations and safety planning, make you aware that at this particular point in time, I am a mandated reporter. And if you share things with me, either if you're an adult and this involves children, or if you are 18 and you're sharing something with me and we're working on a safety plan, I may have to report this out. And so this time frame, elongating that out, would allow for our community-based advocates to kind of really work those very similar safety planning measures that they would for somebody who isn't considered a minor or folks who are victims who are reportable. And so for me, that's kind of the distinction. And I know we had the question around educators who do some forms of safety planning. And what I will say to that too is that, you know, K through 12 folks should and are supposed to implement, you know, Title IX measures in our school system. And there's talk around, you know, training and education around DV and SA. And I would love for that to happen. But what we know to be true is that depending upon what county you're coming from, school boards have been cracking down a lot. And I can say that about mine around even just general, like sexual health and body, you know, body safety education and things like that being even mentioned or talked about or referred in our schools. So, and it's very questionable where Title IX coordination is happening in our K through 12. I know we have maybe like less than a handful of schools who have Title IX coordinators who do K through 12 coordination, who have participated in the Title IX work that we do at CCASA. Certainly not representative of all of our school districts across Colorado. So we still have a lot of work to do around that. Without getting into the weeds of that too much, my point is that our educators, our education systems do and should have already a mechanism in place if they are implementing Title IX. I know for my county, we do have a coordinator named. What they do or how they do those things is still really much up in the air. It's kind of still in that realm of like internal policies and things like that. So
Gina,
my point is, sure.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I really appreciate and don't want to lose some of these nuggets of what you're sharing, but I want to make sure, I think we're conflating some of the conversations. There's a little, I'm picturing what's the thing, a Venn diagram and like where there's overlap and whatnot. And I totally hear you.
Intersection.
Yeah, the intersection. There we go. I totally hear you on these things. And I'm going to call us back a little bit into specifically what we're answering here, because as I am hearing what you're saying around definitions and totally appreciate that and want to make sure that we are able to capture that for, you know, what this group is interested in and whatnot. I do want to make sure that I'm recentering us in the directive specifically here, which I think some of the pieces that you're getting at will take us down another trail. So I'm just gonna, if you're comfortable, I'm just gonna pause you just for a moment on that. And I just want to make sure that as it relates to Directive 7, we're not talking about any sort of definitions of the who or the what there. We're talking about this time frame for mandatory reporters. And that's it as it relates to this specific directive. So that's why I'm just trying to make sure that we stick to that first to make sure that we understand which that's just it's just very in my mind. And Jordan, please jump in if there's any. I'm just trying to make sure that we're centered exactly on what they're asking us, which feels a little bit just narrower and more straightforward. Is that?
It's narrow and broader at the same time, but Trace, you're right. So the directive itself isn't working off that definition in Title 13.
Right.
Right. That's not what the directive is asking us to do. To Jennifer's earlier point, this is a broader scope potentially of professionals who may fall outside that definition of victims advocate. And so what we're trying to figure out, because it's asking about a time frame specifically for people who do these actions. If we want to narrow that in as a group, we can talk about that, but we do have to get responsive to what's in the directive here. So that putting aside the whole distinction that kind of that definition goes back to a different directive. So I think I see Jessica Dotter behind me and she'll probably explain it better than I will, but you're dead on, Trace. Like we have to respond to that directive in place in front of us.
Yeah. Jessica, why don't you jump in and we'll keep, yeah. And Gina, we'll, I mean, again, not trying to totally shelf all the points you're making, but just want to make sure we're getting at this directive specifically. Jessica, jump in and clarify if I'm, yeah.
No, I think Jordan kind of read my mind. Like, so, you know, the directive is the language that the legislature gave our task force to say, do we think that there should be an exception, right, for basically a time frame that would allow, and I think I agree, like the intent behind it was really talking about victim advocates. It would allow victim advocates an additional sort of specific time frame that would then accept them for mandatory reporting until that time had gone by for the purpose of creating a safety plan. I do not think in any way, shape, or form that it creates a responsibility on anyone to create safety plans, nor does the language, like, I think some of the concerns in the chat, right, was like, are we worried about really whether or not teachers should be able to make safety plans, or whether or not police officers or other people should be able to make safety plans? Anybody can make a safety plan, right? That's the whole point, is that like if somebody is a child or an adult or whoever is reporting to a mandatory reporter and they feel like they need to pause and create a whatever plan, I feel like DHS probably does this, right? In order to alleviate some of the concerns that all the advocates have expressed with having to report right away, should they be able to do that? Now, it sounds like to me, right, the funnel is there's mandatory reporters. Within that scope, there's victim advocates. And the victim advocates that I agree totally with, like Rashan and Gina and Jen, that were envisioned when talking about this, are those that are defined with the privilege, right? I mean, we can say as part of the recommendation, like, yes, the task force agrees there should be 72 hours for statutorily defined victim advocates that are mandatory reporters, right? We could say that. We could say that within response to the directive if you felt like it should only be limited to that. I don't know that that should be the case, right? Because then, of course, you're going to have other people who are like, well, I wanted to be able to, help somebody get a civil protection order, and I'm not a victim advocate, but, say me as a DA, I wanted to help somebody get a civil protection order before I reported because I know all about their DV history and know that now that they've disclosed this, they're going to be in higher danger, and I want to wait a few, 72 hours in order to report. I don't know. I mean, why would we want to necessarily restrict the other mandatory reporters from that is kind of my part 2 question. I totally agree. I think we could make one that says our recommendation could be mandatory reporters who are victim advocates should have a 72-hour, hold from their duties, or all mandatory reporters who are creating a safety plan should have that exception. So to me, it doesn't create a responsibility of creating a safety plan. It doesn't make people have to create one. It just says, if you're doing so, then you have extra time set into the statute to report. Also, not to try to confuse more directives, because I also see this the way it's one singular directive. It's not related to whether or not advocates should be mandatory reporters or not, because the legislature doesn't want to be left without answers to questions in case they don't go that route, right? But as a reminder, we talked about one of our directives is to discuss whether the term immediately should be defined, right? And we have discussed, well, should that be more of a time frame? So, right, to me, I actually see those 2 directives as more interrelated, but I don't want to blow things up. I just think that that's, we discussed generally, should we put more parameters around that term immediately? Because does that mean I have to stop my class and go in and report? Does that mean I can wait to the end of the day? We talked a lot about the confusion with mandatory reporters with what does immediately mean. So I think at the end of the day, right, the whole goal is to say, yes, there should be an exception to 72 hours, or an exception to immediately, to allow for people for the purpose of safety planning.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm like, all right, I'm going to let that sit for a minute. Lori and then Stephanie.
My only comment was, it kind of goes back to what Gina was saying. I think that we have to be careful when we start defining, if we decide to define what type of advocate would fall in this, because to just say whether or not you are community-based or system-based does not work for everything. I am a community-based advocacy program providing system-based advocacy to law enforcement. I would not have the privilege to not report under mandatory reporting laws, and I don't want to get, in trouble with my law enforcement people because I'm doing something different than what is required by a law enforcement advocate. So I think, and also as a child advocacy center, yes, we're nonprofit, but we have no confidentiality, and we're doing safety plans and things like that. And so we also are mandatory reporters, and we don't have additional time, 72 hours, to do those things. Those are a mandatory report immediately. So I just think that I agree with Gina. I think that if we are going to talk about advocates, we need to make sure we realize that just because you're system or community-based doesn't mean you fall under those exact guidelines of what every system-based advocacy does and what every community service advocacy does. There are nuances to that. And I would hate for someone like myself to get stuck in this limbo state of, do I report, do I not report, because I'm both.
Well, and Lori, and I really appreciate that. From my understanding with the directive, there is a link to define, like with the definition of who we're talking about here, that would clarify that. Jordan, am I saying that right? And can we drop that in of like who this is referencing?
So
in the chat, Trace.
Are we
It's already in there.
Are we just referencing those that do
Yeah.
safety plans?
No. So
No.
it's not specific to the statute that has already been provided under Title 13.
Gotcha.
The language of the directive is broader. Yes, it was part, and Jennifer, you're right? This was the discussion when we were doing the legislation. However, we didn't write it that way. We didn't end up writing and narrowing into that very specific victim advocate language intentionally, which is why we wrote it broader. So we're not speaking specifically to, in this directive or in Directive 11, that narrow definition of victims advocate. We didn't write it that way. It came up, we wrote it broader. I just also want to point out that keep in mind when we're considering these directives, we're not required to write recommendations. And that's not to say that we're not going to write a recommendation. We're required to analyze what we came up with. So we are able in our report to say, hey, we analyzed very heavily what works here, what didn't. This is where we landed as a group. Maybe it's a recommendation, maybe it's not, but I just want to be very careful. We did not specifically put in that statutory citation intentionally in the directive when we were drafting the legislation. So it's broader.
Okay.
Thanks, Jordan, for clarifying on that. I think it's yeah, Stephanie, jump in.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for the conversation because I think we've had a really robust one, and I appreciate Gina and Jessica because I think you've fleshed out these issues really well. I also find, Trace, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm just trying to analyze this in its entirety. It almost feels like we can't make a recommendation on this until we determine or define the group that it applies to. One is what I hear. So there's a foundational question, which I suppose we could or could not answer, right? We could say, you gave us this broad charge, and we as a group have decided that, yes, there should be extended timeframes for advocates who fall under this provision. We aren't addressing this other set or subset of advocates. I think that's one option. Another option is we just can't address this directive. We've considered it, but we just don't have the ability to do it because the definitions and trying to slice and dice who falls into what bucket is complicated and whatever, requires more analysis, less analysis. I'm not sure. I would defer to my smarter friends than I on that question. So I guess I appreciate everybody's saying we really have to step way back. If we're going to make a recommendation, if we choose not to your point, Jordan, we choose not to, but we can still include this conversation and what our next steps or the community's next steps should be in this discussion. So I'm just trying to figure out a way forward right now, but it's clear to me that the recommendation that has been drafted does not address these more complicating issues that we've talked about today.
Yeah, and Stephanie, as you do, you said it better than what I was trying to say, which was around the definition piece, that we could write a recommendation that way, but that's not how the directive is written here. So I appreciate you kind of bringing that full circle. I'm wondering, as a way forward, actually, that we actually, and Jordan, I'm looking at you, we do that, and then we let folks vote on that. There's this option A of, because I think we've fleshed out as far as what the unique challenges are. So we either write it with this, trying to hone in on this definition of who we're talking about, or we say the second piece of what Stephanie said, and we just put it to vote with the members. And if there's a majority that say, yes, we're comfortable with this, with this more defined definition, then we write it that way. But Jordan, I'm welcome. Yeah. Curious your thoughts here.
Can I just follow up real quick, Trace, before we go to Jordan?
Yeah.
I guess I do have one question, and Jen Isle, I'm looking at you now, my friend. Definitions aside, this is a purely hypothetical. What is your position about extending timeframes in the manner that's been suggested? Is this even is this even a thing that would help the advocates community, regardless of who we define in that bucket? Because I think I'm not clear from what's been said today, whether this is even helpful or not.
Great question. Yeah, Jen.
Yeah. In the absence of taking victim advocates off of the list of mandatory reporters, this could be helpful if we then make this that substitute with the same, referring to the same advocates that are in 1390-107 that's in the chat. I think this as a broad, anybody who is creating a safety plan, which I just think you could give somebody the phone number to a shelter and say you are helping them create a safety plan. I just think that's way too broad. It's way too at risk of abuse. We know that across the board, there is a lack of training and understanding of domestic violence and sexual assault and how it affects children. So I don't have a short answer for you, Stephanie. I guess at this point, if it's an either or, I would say no to this altogether. If we weren't talking about victim advocates no longer being mandatory reporters, and again, it's these specific victim advocates that have privilege by statute, then this could be an alternative. But I don't think we want to have this broad, anyone who's creating a safety plan thing in place. That it really concerns me, and I think it really goes far afield of what we were trying to do here.
So Jen, just to clarify, and I'm sorry if I'm picking on you.
Nope.
I also didn't have a second cup of coffee, so I haven't. It's empty. So my question is where we stand today. If the task force developed a rec that said advocates as defined in 1390-107 would be, the recommendation is, would have extended timelines in which to make their mandatory reports to 72 hours. Is that a policy concept that you would be in favor of? I understand you're in favor of an altogether removal, and there's different depths of which we could go, but just as it relates to today, is that something that you're supportive of?
It's hard to answer that in the abstract of with the other option, but if this was the option on the table, yes. I'll just put it that way.
I'm obviously not going to hold you to that. I just am trying to clarify.
Thanks. Yeah, it's there's so much there.
I do think we have to say it is the option on the table because of the way the directive is written. So I just want to name that, just from like a outside facilitator perspective, we're responding to this directive. And so that is the option on the table as it relates to the directive. That does not mean that we are not having this broader conversation, and then that won't be captured as far as the task force goes. But I would be remiss if we didn't specifically respond to the directive as it's written and saying that that is what we are responding to. So, I understand the context piece and all those pieces, and I think that's super helpful. And the directive as it's written is the directive that we have. So I just want to that's why that's just like me being not devil's advocate, because I think, Jen, you understand what I'm saying, but it's just that's why I'm saying we've got to make sure that we answer it regardless of what the other conversation is, because you're missing the opportunity to respond to the directive as written if you're hinging on this other conversation that might or not get picked up, right? You have to.
But can't we respond to the directive by saying our preference is this? In the alternative, we would consider this with these caveats.
No, because the directive is the answer to the directive as it's written, and with the additional conversation captured, right? But when a directive is written this way, which is the specific language around the mandatory reporting timeframes as it relates, right? As it's written, then it would be first answer that question with the additional then, and the task force also had X, Y, Z conversation and would like to see blah, 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 blah. But as it's related directly to the directive, here is the answer of, yes, we would like a 72-hour delay, right? Does that make sense? That's just a pure process, Jen. That's not opinion. I'm truly just trying to answer it from a process perspective. So, all right. So here's what I'm just trying to make sure, and I'm not trying to strong arm us through whatever, but I'm making sure that we're answering what we need to be answering here, which is this directive as it's written with the 72 hours. So again, putting the conversation on the shelf and talking specifically about the 72-hour for as it's directly written. Can somebody just drop that right back in? Directive 7 and the recommendation that we are writing. Is there any? Because from my perspective, this does, as the directive is related, it feels pretty straightforward that folks are comfortable with the 72-hour delay. Is there anybody that's specifically speaking, as it's written, no, 72 hours is way too long, or I have major concerns, or anything else that you want us to just capture? Otherwise, I want us to to keep going. And Stephanie, I saw you come off. Zane, I saw you come off, and then Gina, I saw your hand come up. So I'm going to go Stephanie, Zane, and then Gina.
Great. And my only clarification, Trace, would be, are we defining what class of advocates that extension belongs to? I personally don't think the directive precludes us from doing that.
Yeah, totally.
I think we're still answering the question, but we're answering it frankly better than the directive was written, by saying, as it relates to advocates as defined in, we recommend a 72-hour extension for safety planning, period. And then the rest is the rest. Certainly the conversation below it would be, the reason we said this category of advocates is because of these reasons. Secondly, there was also robust discussion about limiting these advocates completely from the mandated reporting statute. And here are the reasons, but that's not where we are today. We've responded to the directive. Is that what we're proposing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Who's Zane?
So this question may be completely irrelevant. I don't know. This is an area that I'll confess my own ignorance. But when a sexual assault occurs, maybe I don't fully understand the advocate's role in that as far as the reporting timeframes, because I guess I think to myself, I don't know the timing about rape kits or things like that. I'm thinking about more like the physical evidence that may occur that would be relevant to law enforcement or to prosecutors if a crime has been committed. And I don't know if putting language like that in the statute would cause problems for a victim having access to justice if I don't know if I'm asking this question correctly. I guess I'm worried about any physical evidence and how that works when we're working with victims that have been, assaulted sexually, that could cause a problem for a criminal investigation, perhaps. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
It does make sense. I want to just name one thing that came up because I'm not the content expert on answering that question, but one thing that did come up was the 72-hour piece does not mean that nobody reports until 72 hours. It means that there's the option when it is the best option, right? Then when there is a safety risk for like a survivor, a victim, right? And they want to ensure that we're not having to like be a mandatory reporter before we can actually get that person safe. So that was the scenario and the situation. So in the scenario you're giving, Zane, where there is like something that needs to happen right away, this doesn't exclude people from reporting right away because that's the best situation. It just gives people the opportunity to delay and it's kind of like a trusting the professionals thing, right? These are professionals that are saying, hey, in some cases, we need more time because we need to ensure the safety of the victim. Again, with Roshan's caveat of does this mean that we're ensuring? No, but we need to, the best of our ability, ensure the safety of the victim, and we need more time. And that's where this request came from. So it does not require that you wait 72 hours. It truly just gives it as an option. So that's one answer I'll give you. If there's anybody else though that wants to, is that helpful though? Context?
Thank you. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool. Just because that did come up within the subcommittee conversation. So yeah, and Jessica,
Just in response to that, Trace, too. Yeah. I
please.
feel like and the advocates can tell us, but I feel like part of their work would be to say, okay, let's get you to a hospital and get a sexual assault exam. If that's right, advocates, you would be doing that as part of your reference. So I would hope so.
If that's what the victim wants.
Right.
Yeah, fair.
Right. But yeah, again, it just provides this as an option. So it does not exclude people from, a different scenario. And apologies if I think it was Gina after Zane, and then we'll go Jennifer, and somebody else was in, just drop me a note.
Yeah, definitely. I do want to say I have a little hesitation around it just in terms of allowing even a second more, and we said this in the subcommittee conversation as well, allowing even a minute more for a person who falls under who are reportable victims to endure another hour of sexual abuse or assault. I just want to note that. But in terms of that, I'll also say that there are timeframes around the sexual assault exams and medications that need to be onboarded in order to be effective. And I also want to note that, especially in these times that we're in, that I think that we also should just consider, I'm not asking us to like make room in this recommendation around it, but that where folks will be coming to our state for reproductive care or abortions, it would be helpful for folks to have that window frame to kind of work on how that will work in terms of, is that a reportable thing? Should our medical providers have to be making those reports back to those original states, and what are those implications? I think there's just this larger piece there. I just want to make sure that we're also noting and acknowledging that those are also real scenarios that I think that are just, we're just beginning, and just the tip of it. And I think we'll continue to see that as an issue.
Thank you, Gina. I really appreciate your comments there. I want to, Jen, if you're okay, I want to just pause just for 1 second, because Jordan, I appreciate the quick turnaround stab at like throwing in kind of what we're referencing. Can I just give you an opportunity to talk through that real quick?
Yeah, I just was attempting to bring in that narrowing language as was suggested. And then Jennifer, in your response to, the comment that maybe we can't really ensure, I lightened that language to address the safety, so it wasn't so definitive. And then I just replicated the citation used in the list. So just an attempt to get us to that narrow factor. I took the language of mandatory reporters out in the second sentence so that we were very clear we were focusing on victims advocates in this recommendation only as defined in Title 13. So it's a real quick hit, but it was just an attempt to kind of get at what we were talking about.
Yeah, and Roshane, I know that you were the one that had talked about in the ensure language, so jump in if there's any concern there too. But Jennifer, didn't want to cut you off from whatever comments, but just wanted to make sure that we had that additional context too of the latest version of what we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. I wanted to respond to Zane's comments about involving law enforcement.
Yeah.
That is really entirely up to, from the perspective of a victim advocate as defined in statute, those of us that are speaking for that group of folks today. That is entirely up to the survivor whether they want to involve law enforcement, and many times they don't, and many times in the context of domestic violence in particular, it is not a crime that's being committed. The safety danger is a result of coercive control and other behaviors that don't rise to the level of something that would be charged as a crime. One of the incredibly valuable pieces of having victim advocates be have legal privilege and be able to keep things confidential is that we can provide extensive and really valuable services without ever having to get those systems involved if that's not what the survivor wants. And there are 1,000 reasons why people don't. And sexual assault very frequently does not get reported to law enforcement as well. And if you look at the numbers, there's like the percentage of sex assault that gets reported, and there's the percentage that gets charged, and there's the percentage that gets prosecuted, and there's a percentage that results in a guilty verdict, and it goes smaller and smaller and smaller. Jessica Dotter can speak to that far more effectively than I can. But I really don't want us to get the idea that law enforcement is somehow a crucial piece of safety for a survivor in these contexts.
Appreciate that, Jennifer, and seeing Zane's comment there in the chat too. So thank you for that additional kind of context and thought there. Okay, so with the language that Jordan dropped in, again, we're not taking a vote right now, but any specific thoughts there or feedback to the language piece? I think Jordan, I really appreciate that, because I think we took a stab at addressing kind of all the pieces there that folks have talked about. So any glaring for the good of the group that you want to just make sure that you raise? Roshane, I think your hand's in your bookcase. Go ahead. I always get lost there. You're on mute. Before it looked
Sorry, I
like it
keep
was gonna-
lowering my hand.
It looked
I
like it
keep
was going to
lowering
be
my
a good one.
Oh, it's a good one, right? No, I just don't want to lose sight of, as you all know, my primary goal here, which is to keep victims advocates from being mandatory reporters at all. So, you know, we have voted on that. That's a recommendation that was brought forward, or the subcommittee did. So, and this may sound like I'm saying two different things, and I'm sorry if I'm being confusing to folks who aren't like as deep in this part of the work, but I want to make sure with the 72-hour directive, I'm not super in favor of changing it actually to. So I had concerns about just everybody having the opportunity to safety plan, because frankly, as a DV advocate, I've heard people say I'm in a safety plan in ways that I know aren't actually safe for survivors, because not everybody totally understands the dynamics. That was my concern about everybody having the 72 hours. I also want to say, though, that I don't want to leave. I don't want to send. I'm a little concerned about putting forward directives that have two different ideas about what confidential community-based victim advocates do. They're not, like if we send one forward that says they're not mandatory reporters, and then another that says as mandatory reporters, they have 72 hours to safety plan. I think that's confusing. And I would rather not leave that option open, to be honest. I'd rather if we all agree and vote in one direction, that we make a clear statement that this is a group of people we should carve out. So I'm not sure where exactly that fits in. I just hate to walk away from the conversation. I know it's not an either or, but I think if we put forward two directives about one community that say two different things, I do think it may be confusing for the folks making the law. And I'd rather not have the option of leaving people in. I'd rather us get taken out. So that's just my.
So I totally hear you on that. My response to that, and stick with me on this, is so happy to just kind of bat this back and forth, but the directive, there was no directive around the removal of victims advocates, right? That was a subsequent conversation of
Just my personal directive.
Oh, totally, right? So totally,
you,
and a
everyone, for
number
indulging me.
of folks, right? And so we have captured that, but I just want to be really clear when we're talking about the language of directive and recommendation and those sorts of things. Our recommendations center around the directives, right? However, there has been this much larger conversation and interest from a number of folks in the group around removal of victim advocates. And that will be captured as far as the narrative of the report goes in supplement and support of the directives themselves. But we cannot not respond to the directives as written, because those were the legislative directives for the task force. So I just want to so I totally hear you, and I get that that's frustrating. And just from a process perspective, here are our recommendations as it relates to the scope of this task force and the legislative directives. And there were these additional conversations, and there was, the group that XYZ, right? And that's around the removal of victim advocates. So that's the difference there. And I just want to make sure that we're clear about directives, recommendations versus narrative on a report there. So that's why we have to make sure that we're carving out specific response to this as written.
And I do understand that distinction, and I understand why we have to respond to this directive. I'm just saying, if we respond by carving out, like if we respond in this new language that Jordan just put forward, I think then we're going to offer two suggestions that counter each other in ways that I would be confused about, and I would lean towards responding to this directive in a different way, either leaving it in the original language and just kind of assuming that people will make a choice.
Totally.
And if they don't have the training, they won't. Maybe they'll say, I'm not a qualified person to safety plan, so I'm going to go ahead and report or whatever.
Yeah.
Or saying we're not going to do that one. But if we respond to this directive with that carve out for only victims advocates, then we are countering another recommendation we're putting forward, or we're offering two different ideas. So I get that we have to do both, that we have to talk about this one. I'm just saying, I would lean away from talking about it in this way.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you. And I think as far as the writing of the report goes, it's just a helpful reminder for us of that concern there. So I think you'll see reflected, but I also, again, just with the language of recommendation, the recommendation is just around this directive and not around the removal piece, right? That is more the narrative. So we will delineate there, and we'll have to, Jordan, before has this baby, is committing a lot of time on the writing side. So I'm just looking at Jordan. I'm like, we've got quite the task, and make sure that we're able to you know, address these sort of concerns. So Rashan, I appreciate what you're saying and totally noted. And yeah, just appreciate your thoughtfulness on that. Jade, and then I want to move us to a quick little brain break before I move us on into our next conversation, because I do want us to be sure we have an opportunity to keep going. Go ahead, Jade.
Yeah, I'm just curious, since this is the directive that speaks directly to advocates, those creating the safety plans, could we include both recommendations under this directive? Like, I understand we have to respond to the directive, but could our recommendation say, first and foremost, excuse me, first and foremost, our recommendation is that advocates under this definition are exempted from mandatory reporting. Second of all, if that's not the way if that's not an option, this is our recommendation around timeframes. Just to kind of Roshan's point, like, this is the directive that speaks to that audience. So can we respond to with what we think that group of mandatory reporters needs? Yes, we'll have it in the other one that also is about who should be exempted. But I just wonder if that would make more clear what the task force as a whole is recommending, that this is our preference. This is our backup plan. And I think, Jordan, that's probably a question for you and how you want to write it, but go ahead, Trace.
Yeah. And Jordan, I'm looking at you as far as, Stephanie. Stephanie, you jump in as far as scope of this directive goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to take a big step back first. And that is, does this group even agree with those propositions? Right? We haven't even taken even a straw poll on whether we agree there should be an extension for a limited group of advocates, let alone do we agree that there should be a carve out entirely. So I just want to be, I want to comply with process and make sure that this entire group has an opportunity to vote before we start heading in any specific direction. So that's my caution with that approach is I think we need to rewind now that we've had this full conversation and then move forward from there.
So how about Stephanie with that? I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to kind of, I'm going to throw our planning team into a quick group to make sure that we're, because again, we're up against time, right, with remaining meetings. So we could use some of this meeting to do some of that work that we want to do. So why don't we put the group to a quick break? If the facilitators and planning team can stick with me in a room, let's just figure out how we're going to do that. And then we'll come back from the break. We'll do that. And then we'll move this conversation along, just knowing that we have a couple of other topics that we do have to get to. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay, cool. So we're building the plane as we fly it, which is my favorite. Let's take a 10-minute break. And I'm going to toss us into a breakout room, just as an FYI. And then, so if everybody and on the task force though, let's do 9:20 is when we come back. And we'll have some direction from there around how to do just that. And then we'll keep going. Sound good? Cool. All right. Thanks y'all. 9:20. There we go. When we vote on final recommendations, you'll see this language again, but we just, for our writing purposes, we want to make sure we understand where folks are. So this is not like the final report. This is like, help us move this conversation forward. Okay. So we're going to take a quick straw poll, which we're going to use our digital hands on two things. One, as it relates to the directive specifically with the 72-hour piece. Two, this idea of additional legislative considerations and this conversation of removal of victims advocates as it relates to the consideration of removal of victims advocates as defined in Title 1390-107. Okay, and we'll put language in the chat for both, so it's crystal clear what you're taking a straw poll on. Again, this is not an official vote. This is just to help us in our writing so that when we get to the final vote that we actually are being reflective of what the conversation was. Kathy, go ahead, and then we're going to jump in.
Quick question. So I know there was a little bit of dialogue in the chat right before the break. Is there a clarification that victim means adult victims, or are child and youth victims included in this around the being served by these victim advocates around these issues around assault. And would, by extension, either have an extension of the time that they would need to report up to 72 hours and or potentially be included in the question around being excluded as a victim advocate.
I'm gonna ask Jordan to weigh in on that, or Stephanie.
I just want to make sure I'm looking at the right chat. So
Yeah, can we pause the chat? Can no one?
I'm losing my breath.
Yeah, we're jumping around, so if folks can just pause their chat. Go ahead, Jordan.
Yolanda, are you trying? I know that one of the things was from you. Were you trying to jump in?
No, sorry. Thank you.
So I think, Dr. Wells, if you're talking about the word victim and whether or not we're applying adult, I think that this is all within the context of the mandatory reporting statute. Now someone smarter than that can jump in for me. This is also something we can address later on. I'm trying to get to the general ethos right now on that. For the chat,
I guess my question is, so when it says creating a safety plan for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, when we, in that piece of the directive, is that victim referring to victims of all ages?
Stephanie, I see you talking.
Yeah, and I'm just talking out loud. My feeling is, Kathy, at least how I've always read this, is that involves victims of domestic violence, sex assault, and stalking. In other words, adult victims who go for services. And then, right, in that context of securing assistance, they make a disclosure that their child has also somehow been harmed. And that's the mandated report that needs to be made. So I read this as adult victims in these categories, period. But I don't know why my thinking about it could be off. I would have to go back, and I'm going to look at you, Jessica. I would need to go back and look at the definition of victims, but my belief is that that is statutorily created within this Title 13, and that we would have to just review that, but maybe I'm wrong.
I agree with you, Stephanie. I see the scenario that you just laid out as being kind of the issue. And I think the intent was right to create it so that, say, when a mother comes in for seeking services for domestic violence, and then we also, like that reporter learned, or the advocate learns about child abuse, but they want the time to set up the safety plan, then, regardless of really that the initial call in was for an adult, that it allows that safety planning for the family. I think also the language of and the victim's family members kind of encompasses both adults and children. I also think I kind of agree, like this is something certainly that when it comes to whether the legislature creates a bill out of this, they'll have to address which definitions they want to use and clarify those. So I think it's a really good point. But as far as the recommendation go, right, that goes the heart of it is, whether there should be this exception for the time frame.
And I guess, Kathy, I would ask, what difference does it make? Because at the end of the day, right, whether if, let's just say hypothetically, a young person came in, they sought the services of an advocate and they said, I was abused and I'm under 18, right? So it's child abuse. And, or the mother comes in and says, my young child suffered abuse. Either way, there's an extension of 72 hours. Like, I guess I'm just trying to understand, what difference does it make for the treatment of the child when you're saying already that you don't have to make a mandatory child abuse report in these certain circumstances up into 72 hours? And that's a question really for everybody.
Well, and I don't, I'm not a legal person, and so I don't mean to, but to me, if the distinction is that it is a minor that is disclosing this, are we saying that we're okay with delaying that report up to 72 hours? Because it may have implications, I would suspect, from a public safety perspective, from a perspective of other potential victims of whoever the perpetrator is, from an investigation, from a protection issue. So I see Yolanda has her hand up regarding the protection issue, but that would be just my question.
No, I appreciate that, Kathy. Thank you, because I think that was, where I was also wondering sort of down a path in my mind of if it is somebody under the age of 18 that is disclosing being a victim of sexual assault, of stalking and domestic violence, and who that maybe potentially alleged perpetrator is, what are the implications of delaying a report when we're talking also about like there are parental rights involved in determining where your child or youth can be. And so I don't know how that looks as far as safety planning when it comes from the victim advocate's perspective in not like interfering with the parental's right, a parent's right to know where their child or their youth is. So I think that that's one question I have in my mind. I think a second is also the way I read sort of that language around victim of stalking, domestic violence, sexual assault being, I think, implied an adult victim and then discussing their family members. I also wonder, how does this apply to what if that adult victim that a victim advocate is safety planning with is the alleged perpetrator of the abuse or neglect? So we're talking about delaying reporting. What if that is one of the people or persons who is an alleged perpetrator of abuse or neglect on that child? And so if the safety planning involves that parent, like you mentioned the word mother, so that mother and her children, if she's an alleged perpetrator of she's an adult victim or survivor of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, yet she is an alleged perpetrator, potentially of child abuse or neglect, I worry about that as well in the delay of reporting.
Any other comments here or thoughts before we, Jordan, does that shift any language as we're writing, just kind of what we need to understand from folks as far as the directive goes?
Can I ask somebody to pull up, Brian? I see you. Can you pull up 1390-107 and see where the definition of victim is?
And this is Yolanda again, sorry. Maybe that's also a question for the victim advocates or those that represent victim advocates to understand when it is somebody, a minor under the age of 18 that is coming in to seek services, how does safety planning differ with that minor victim than it would with an adult victim due to considerations around parental rights and interfering, or if that youth or child is is a runaway. Like, I'm just curious if there's any difference, because I think that has to be part of the consideration if we're talking about whether victim means adult or victim means it could be anyone, adult or anyone under the age of 18.
And partially this will go to Directive 11, which we have not gotten to today, but right. Yeah, Doris. So 11 is what actually deals with when a person we believe is a victim of a child is a victim of dating violence or sexual assault. So to forecast that a little bit.
Brian, can you pull out the specific language in there just so that we're not sending folks down a long legal rabbit hole in the reading?
Yeah, and I took out some of the additional caveats for not law enforcement folks, but this is the heart of it.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's not a definition for victim in there. So I don't think that gets to the age issue that people are talking about. There's a definition for victim's advocate.
Yeah.
And I don't know, Stephanie, there's a definition for, right. I don't, that's all I have right now.
I mean, this is
legislative drafting more of an issue than it is recommendation, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Someone can help center me for a second, because maybe I'm not following. So I appreciate the distinction between child or adult in who discloses the information and where that's coming from and how that involves a safety plan. But what I don't quite track is, how does that impact what is actually the responsibility of the mandatory reporter, because that still relies on their knowledge of the situation. So how the knowledge comes in isn't necessarily what was at issue. Jessica, I see you nodding. Do you try to, because it's still the mechanism of the reporter themselves, not necessarily the information and how it was obtained. So if we're still talking about an exemption from the reporter themselves, back to Stephanie's original question, do we need to draw this tight distinction between where the information came from for the purposes of this directive and response? Because I'm just not quite tracking why we're melding the two together, I guess.
I mean, I think for me, and I didn't mean to drop a bomb. I mean, I think for me, if it's a caregiver is disclosing sexual assault, domestic violence, all those things, then obviously it's up to the person who received the information to determine, like, is this really, really urgent, right? I think that and to me, the assumption was it was an adult caregiver of a child, right? And so that the impacted child is not the actual victim of the assault. I think that certainly a youth could be seeking these sort of same services. And so if a youth is seeking the services, you know, and maybe we all agree that it doesn't matter who's seeking them, right? And we rely upon the victim advocate to make a decision like, is this more of an urgent report because of, you know, and that's fine. And maybe the recommendation is, you know, good as it stands, that it's just but I just wanted to make sure that I captured some things that were in my head and then hit the chat around when we're talking about the victim that disclosed to the victim advocate, are we talking really assuming that it's disclosing that they're the victim as an adult and their child might be impacted versus it's actually a youth that's disclosing in that setting and they're the victim.
Yes, and I hear that, and we can certainly put that in the discussion. I think I'm still just stuck on why would we create a distinction in the reporting requirements depending on how the information came in, which we don't do anywhere else in statute.
I think, Jordan, for me, this is Yolanda again. My question would be, so if I'm a youth and I disclose sexual assault to my guidance counselor at school, that report comes to the attention of child protection immediately or the same day, right, within the current statute requirements. If I disclose that to a victim advocate, then it's potentially up to 3 days later that same information gets reported. I think that I'm hearing what Kathy is saying, and that's how I'm understanding it as well. If it is the child or youth who is disclosing being the victim of stalking, sexual assault, or domestic violence, so they are the victim there. It's not, you know, the family situation as far as being impacted and exposed to it. They are the actual direct victim of it, being dating violence, stalking, sexual assault. I think that would be my question is like, again, if I report to a school staff, I'm getting, or a medical professional, I'm getting reported the same day. If I report to a domestic violence victim advocate, the same youth, the same information, it's up to 3 days later. I think that would concern me.
And Yolanda, I think we're actually saying the same thing because we're talking about the mechanism for the mandatory reporter themselves, right? So if the mechanism for the school is you got to report within 24 hours, yes, I agree. Same youth makes same report to an advocate under Title 13, and now we get that 72-hour delays. That's the mechanism we're talking about. We're not talking about where the information came from. We're talking about who received it. So I think we're saying the same thing. And I just want us to get us focused on what's actually responsive under the statute and the rec, because I hear you, right? 3 days if we go to a victim's advocate, 24 hours if we go to an educator. That's the question. Am I right? I'm just trying to make sure I'm centering here. And it's less about who brings it, because who brings the information doesn't dictate the requirement. It's who the mandatory reporter is.
Well, I do want to say that I think, yes, to the first part of that, Jordan. I think the second part, though, is that if it is an adult victim of domestic violence, stalking, or sexual assault who is disclosing that information to somebody they're working with as a victim advocate, then there might be, maybe that adult person, that adult victim or adult survivor doesn't directly disclose impact to the child, yet describes a situation in which a child is, or a youth is witness to the situation, has maybe tried to intervene in the situation, has maybe, you know, seen behavioral changes that seem to indicate some type of impact to the child, having witnessed, you know, perpetration on their mother or whomever's the victim that's talking to the victim advocate. So I'm wondering, like, and I know we're getting a little bit too, like, or I'm getting in the weeds with that nuance. I think it is, I'm curious how this could play out if it is an adult person who's disclosing to the victim advocate their experience of violence or abuse, control, coercive control, all of that, and they're not necessarily disclosing specifics on how that violence that is being witnessed or experienced within the home for that adult survivor is impacting the child, yet that for those skilled victim advocates, they know that there's impact potentially on the children, right? That exposure can create impact on the children, even if it's not called out specifically. So I'm wondering, like, how, like, at what point would victim advocates believe that their responsibility to report suspected or known child abuse because of their skilled knowledge versus the client or the adult survivor or victim of abuse and stalking and sexual assault would draw that connection specifically, if that makes sense.
It does.
So like the nuance of that.
And I definitely hear the nuance, and I appreciate you going step by step with me because it's really helpful. I think my response then is, so we've not adjusted that threshold question, right? Once you have knowledge or reasonable cause to suspect, that's not changed. And so once a mandatory reporter in their expertise, under their designation under the mandatory reporting statute, met that threshold of knowledge, because we're not adjusting that, I don't see that as changing, right? So, and then it goes back to what you just said, which is educator gets that knowledge from a parent. Great. I have 24 hours if it meets that threshold. Victim advocate maintains that, hits that threshold. I have 72 hours to report. That still hits that same kind of distinction point. So I hear what you're saying. I just think because that threshold mechanism is not changed, I don't think, I'm just trying to get at what we're talking about, because that threshold hasn't changed. So again, how the information comes in hasn't changed, and what it triggers, it just triggers the timeline based on the person who gets it.
Okay, thank you, Jordan. This will be my last comment question. I appreciate everyone's patience with me. I think my other question is, how would this potential recommendation, how would it be impacted if the adult survivor, adult victim disclosing sexual assault, domestic violence, or stalking doesn't want to engage in safety planning? Does that change the threshold for the mandatory reporter to have to report if there's no safety planning happening and the disclosure happens and no safety plan happens?
A great question, and I appreciate you asking it. At least in my mind, because we've not changed that threshold, no. If that information has come light to a mandatory reporter in any fashion, right, and it's still information that they have to report, I'm looking for someone to give me a nod that I'm still on the right track here. I think that threshold remains the same.
Yes.
Okay, so I got a couple nods. Yeah, so that it's not making it discretionary. Once it comes forward, regardless of the safety planning, what we're just trying to put in place is a delay so we can get this rolling for a victim's advocate, but not negate the duty to report as the rec is currently written.
Yeah, that's where I keep wanting to bring us back to, which is like kind of the point with Zane earlier with your question, where it's like, again, this does not say like, okay, everybody's not reporting till 72 hours. This was an ask to better support victims advocates in the scenarios that a delay would be in the best interest of the victim, of the safety of the scenario, et cetera. And that's it. It's not changing any sort of definition or threshold, or like you said, Jordan, it's truly just about having the option when there is like as I read the directive, when there is a safety issue at hand, et cetera. And that's what this is all about. So keeping it narrow in that sense as it relates to this recommendation. And I think that then I think what we're getting though is the nuance of the removal of the victim's advocate, which is kind of where this keeps coming back to, which again is a second question here. So I do just want to, I see Jennifer and Stephanie's hands up. Can I just move us to, okay, so Stephanie's good. Jennifer, do you have, I think we're getting close to be able to just take a quick straw poll on this specific directive and then additional language around this additional legislative considerations around removal, and then move us on. But Jennifer, jump in. Don't side.
I'll keep this really short.
Don't curveball me too much, please.
I'm not. I'm going to try to keep this really short and address something that came up during this discussion, which is that unlike medical care and mental health services, young people do not have the legal right to access victim advocacy services without the involvement of a parent. So there's no clear statute that says if you're over the age of 15, you can go get victim services and, your parent doesn't have to be involved. That gets even more complicated if it's legal advocacy. So I just want to put that out there because I think that's important to understand that more often than not, and Rashan and Gina, please jump in, if a minor is accessing the services of these programs they are doing it with the assistance of an adult.
Well, that would be it. Yeah, is that true, Roshan? And okay. So that gets at, I think, what some folks were asking around a child, around the how the information comes in. Okay. Jennifer, put the hand down. All right, y'all. So I'm gonna put the language. There we go. Thanks, Jordan. Okay, pause on the chat. Woo. All right, y'all. This is a really great discussion. I really appreciate it. So again, as the directive is specifically written, we're responding around this is the language that we're asking. Would you be in support of this? And again, this is not an official vote. This is just that we understand so that we can write as it relates to the directive. And I want to be clear that we will then ask a second question, which is around additional legislative considerations of the consideration of removal of advocates, and would you be in support of that as well? And that will be a separate section. It will not be couched specifically with this because we need to delineate between the two. So what we are asking now, which is a digital hand, not just the thumbs up because that disappears, but the digital raise your hand. So for recommendation for Directive 7, would this task force support a recommendation around amending the statute to allow for extended reporting timeframes for victims advocates as defined in section 1390-107, who are creating a safety plan for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking to address the safety of the victim and the victim's family members while creating the safety plan. In these instances, victims advocates will be required to make a report within 72 hours. So again, they have the option of the 72 hours. If you are in support of this, please raise your hand and we'll give. I'm going to give 30 seconds remaining. Just keep your hand up and we will make note of this. Addie, if you can record these and I'll let us know the official cutoff time. All right, go ahead and lower your hands. Yeah, Jaden, I think that's a totally reasonable edit clarification for what the intent is. Jordan, does that sound good? Okay. So within up to 72 hours. That's just again, clarification of intent. All right. 15 recorded yeses on that. If you are not in support of this recommendation for Directive 7, please raise your hand. And I will have an abstention option too, just FYI. I'm going to give 30 seconds. Someone's hand went away. Is that intentional?
It was me, yes.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Okay, 2 recorded no votes. And then abstention. Please raise your hand. If you're abstaining from this. $30 seconds. Okay, 2 abstentions from vote. Lower your hand, thank you. Okay, second straw poll, again, not the final vote on. So is this notion around creating additional legislative considerations? So I'm going to drop in the chat. Again, what this would look like in the report would be literally a separate section, because again, we will have recommendations as it relates specifically to the directives, and those are the recommendations. These are considerations because of the conversations that have been had within the task force. So do not think of this as a recommendation, but instead a consideration that the task force is asking of legislators to consider. So additional legislative considerations. Are you in support of the task force creating a section of additional legislative considerations, which would include the consideration of a removal of victims advocates as defined in Title 1390-107. I will drop that in the chat. Pause on the chat for a second so folks understand, and then asking for those of you that are in support of this as an additional consideration to please raise your digital hand. All right, 30 seconds. All right, go ahead and lower your hand. Seeing 11 yes there. Again, we'll have an option for no and to abstain. If you are, let me make sure everybody's hands are lowered. That was a yes. Donna, you are a yes, right? Make sure you lower. All right, cool. Okay, so moving to no, that you are not in support of this additional legislative consideration of removal of victims advocates as defined in 1390-107. Okay, Dawn has moved to a no. So 10, just seeing that in the chat. So Addie, make note of that, please. All right. Okay, so we have 11 no vote, 10 vote, and please lower your hands. Lisa, can you lower your... All right, and then if you're abstaining from this vote, please raise your hand. Okay. All right. Thank you, Ayla. One abstention. All right. So we also will, again, we'll put these out to the, we know that there are folks that are absent from today's meeting. So as always, we'll also put those out to the group in a follow-up email, because as recorded, we have 23 votes and we know that we have more members of the task force. So we will give the opportunity there as well, just as a heads up. I know some folks are kind of like, is this the, and so again, that doesn't mean that this will not, I just want to be super clear. This will still be captured either way as a conversation, because it was something that was a significant conversation, as Jennifer said in the chat with our subcommittee. Does not mean that this would completely dissolve from the narrative itself. It would just be not a official consideration broken out, right? It would just be more captured in the narrative around that this was the discussion of the group. Okay. So with that said, again, those will go out to poll to the broader group, because we do want folks that were not participating today to have the option to participate in that. so that we can make sure that our writing is reflective of the full group and not just those that are present today. So with that, why don't we, do folks need a quick 5-minute break? How are we doing? 5-minute break, thumbs up, or okay, let's do a quick 5-minute break. And then we're gonna come back and dive into this medical abuse discussion with Kathy kicking you off. So I just want folks to kind of be able to reset a little bit. So we'll come back about 3 minutes after 10 o'clock and we'll get going from there. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah, I'm laughing, Trace. It's like frying pan into the fire.
Yeah. I was like, it's gonna be a little too whiplashy to just jump right in. So
There's no reprieve today.
yeah. Let's take a 5er and come back. Okay. Thanks, y'all.
Good morning, Michelle Dossi.
Good morning.
Thank you for your notes yesterday.
You're welcome. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't disappoint you.
We'll be in touch though.
And we're back. All right.
Gee, Kathy, how are you going to simplify this whole thing now?
Oh, this is such an easy thing to simplify. I think I will make it simple. How's that? I'm going to give my best.
I am going to drop in kind of where we're at, Kathy, just as a reminder to folks of what we wrote. So let's take a minute to read that just so that we're regrounded in where we are. And then Kathy, I'll hand it over to you. So we're moving on. And again, thanks y'all for some really, really great discussion today. I know there's a lot and we'll continue. And again, not everyone is here. So as far as those polls go, we'll put those out to the broader group. So appreciate your understanding there, and we'll follow up with folks so that you know where things are. All right, so moving on to Directive 8, which is analyze medical child abuse and the process to report medical child abuse. Again, this was the extensive conversation within the subcommittee, and this is what they are recommending and where we have drafted the language. So address the process to report medical child abuse and its discussions of Directives 13 and 14, which specifically require the task force to consider these two pieces. As it relates to the further analyzing medical child abuse, the task force determined that is beyond the scope of the task force's charge. So just want to be clear that that is kind of broadly where folks landed, but Kathy, want to give you the opportunity to jump in, give some context, and then let's have a conversation.
Yes, I think the best place for me to start with context is just really to quickly ground everybody in what medical child abuse is, because this is sort of an evolved terminology that I think can be complex and confusing. So essentially, you know, when we talk about child abuse, we talk about a range of things, right? So physical abuse, pretty easy to understand, sexual abuse, neglect. And then there is this thing that is essentially kind of almost a polar opposite of neglect in some ways, right? Philosophically, is that is the notion, and it used to be in some other terms that have been and sometimes are used are Munchausen syndrome by proxy, factitious disorder by proxy. And so essentially it is a range of things that can occur when a caregiver is on one end of the spectrum is excessively seeking care for a child for an illness that may, or illness or circumstance that may actually exist, medical problem or medical challenge, all the way to someone who is making up things or fabricating things that might exist for that child and seeking medical care for those things. And then on the furthest end of the spectrum is someone who's actually causing illness for the purposes of getting and seeking medical care for the purposes of attention. And I will just say this is very complex. It is probably not as uncommon as we thought it used to be, or we thought it was. I think some of that could be more awareness around the disorder, and also things like social media and other ways for people to seek secondary gain. I guess that's the best way to describe it. It's also a bit debated in the medical community. Is this a medical problem for the adult person that's doing this, or is it a problem for the child? And I think that really most people in our community sort of see it as a little bit of both, right? So there is an underlying probably psychiatric or some kind of component in the person that's committing this activity, often a parent. But it is abusive to the child, right? Because what's happening for the child is creating harm. So that is the very high overview. Typically, these kinds of cases require multiple systems to work closely together. But at the end of the day, pretty grounded in in the medical system, helping people understand, you know, what is real in terms of the medical problems that this child is presenting, what might not be real. So let me give an example. Is people may or may not be aware of this, but a child can have a seizure disorder, and they may not even have findings that we can clearly document in the healthcare system, right? So we might have an EEG of their brain waves. We might not detect seizure activity. They could still have a seizure disorder. In that case, it would be largely based on what is observed in that child. And if what is observed is only observed outside of a medical setting, sometimes that diagnosis might be made without a medical provider actually seeing the circumstance. So that's an example. It's complicated. And the reason the medical community is a big part of diagnosing this is, or determining this, or being at least working with our investigative team when it comes to that, is because at the end of the day, someone medically needs to say, is this a real medical problem or not? Is someone exaggerating the medical problem, or is someone potentially actually creating the medical problem? So having that context, it seemed like a lot of the issues around this were probably less about trying to make sure that medical people diagnose this the right way, or investigators are investigated the right way. It was a little bit more about how and when do these situations come to the awareness of authorities. So what I mean by that is there is a time period when oftentimes in the healthcare community, someone's trying to determine whether this child really has this illness, or if someone is actually exaggerating or creating that illness. And I think the group really felt like that really is something that that shouldn't be determined by legislation. That's something that really should be relying upon the knowledge of the individuals. And when they have a reasonable suspicion that abuse or neglect is occurring, they're mandated to make that report. Nothing changes that, right? So that would fit with medical child abuse, right? When I have a reasonable concern that a reasonable suspicion that medical child abuse is occurring, that's when I meet the threshold of the mandate. So the questions really felt like they were more around these other two issues, right? So what is that duty to report for that mandated reporter, and what does that look like? Can I designate someone else to do that? What is the systems in place in terms of hospital? And again, we've talked about this in a larger context, not just medical systems, but other institutions that hold mandatory reporters. What are those policies and procedures that exist in those institutions to address this? And so it felt like those were the two things that really helped us address the issues around this challenging problem. The final thing that I would say is, if we wanted to get into a deeper dive, in which, in a look that Brian and team did, there are just 3 states that even have language that even pulls out medical child abuse or Munchausen by proxy, or so it's not like and even in polling my colleagues, I think everyone that feels like that this isn't something that necessarily needs to be pulled out in statute. It's something that is really a systems piece that needs to be addressed, and making sure that statute supports what this, that institutions that employ mandatory reporters have policies in place to fulfill that requirement. So, and thanks, Brian, for putting that policy scan in there, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't missing like a big trend that was happening elsewhere in other legislative settings. And it doesn't appear that we are. My recommendation is, if that's what we needed to do, this is a much bigger conversation that is very complex, and probably would need to be taken on by a group moving forward. But really, we felt like these two areas, whether the duty to report remains with the mandatory reporter, and then whether institutions can should have policies in place to support mandatory reporters, really met that need. So that is, I think, hopefully I captured the conversations in the subcommittee well. Obviously, I welcome any additional thoughts if I missed something or mischaracterized something.
Yeah, any additional thoughts from the subcommittee before we open it up to just a broader conversation? All right, so again, the language in the that dropped in around Directive 8 is the language we're looking at as far as it relates to a draft recommendation. So that's what we're talking about. So want to open this up. Obviously, Kathy did a great job of, Dr. Wellesley did a great job of, I think, laying the groundwork for kind of how we got where we got with this, and where we see the scope within this task force or with outside of the task force. So I'm guessing folks this is something that, that I kind of felt like a lot of folks were being very deferential to folks that, this is the work they do. And so Dr. Wells and other folks within hospitals and the representation there's just some really strong consensus around what we felt like was within the scope. So curious if there's any questions from folks concerns? What do you like about what was said? Any thoughts? We just make everybody really tired, so they're like, no thought. Okay, there we go. Gina.
Come on, button. Okay. I do want to lift up that there was a concern I had around, and this is why we ended up where we did, some of why, is around the red flags or kind of the suspicions or things like that, what those things were grounded in, and that for me, my concern was around especially around what this was rooted in, which was to also center folks who are in marginalized communities and how they're impacted by mandated reporting, and that oftentimes we have to, as people of color in marginalized communities, we are oftentimes having to like fight for every breath in medical and healthcare settings, oftentimes not being believed, oftentimes not having our pain threshold taken seriously. And so we have to be very, unfortunately, studied and articulate about what ails us and what is ailing our children. And that it was concerning to me that some of those kind of red flags was naming that specifically was that a potential abuser is unusually articulate in health rhetoric or things like that. And that was a little concerning to me, especially in terms of folks who oftentimes we have to be sharper than we want to be, and that it's an extra layer of exhaustion on top of, you know, trying to seek care for things that are going on with us and our children, and that oftentimes we're not taken very seriously. And so it has to come from this place of, well, I've read into this and all of that, all of those pieces. I know for me, you know, when providing care for my mother, I had to keep this pill book of like what pills look like, which is so crazy to have to do, right? Because our pharmacy had made like serious mistakes in what kinds of pills were issued out to her, but was not what was labeled on it. And so we just have to always be on top of our game, and that it was concerning to me that that might also be an indicator or a red flag that could mean something, some other form of abuse was going on. And so just wanting to name that was a concern that was brought up for me.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, Gina. As always, appreciate you sharing the personal stories that you're willing to share. So thank you for that. Kathy, I saw you jump in, so go ahead and.
Yeah, I just, thanks, Gina. And I sorry I didn't bring that up. I mean, it was honestly really enlightening for me to hear that, right? I mean, that sort of cultural context, that lens of, and to be honest with you, it kind of underscores how challenging these cases are for health practitioners, right? We have to trust that when someone seeks healthcare, the information they're giving us is accurate. And it's no different from when someone's seeking healthcare of their kids, which makes this situation probably even most challenging, right? That we want to assume that when a parent is there seeking healthcare for their child, what they're telling us is accurate, and that's what we have to act on, right? And it makes it challenging in sort of just general child abuse cases, physical abuse, for sure, but really particularly in this sort of scenario. I will say in general, interestingly, most I would say most of the cases that I have experienced of this were actually someone who is not of certain disadvantaged population, someone who's actually quite advantaged. I think, unfortunately, that makes these cases even harder because they can fly under the radar for a long time because someone looks, is a person of maybe means, knowledge, resources, and is really advocating for the needs of their kids. And the community sees that as something that is a good thing, right? So it can really, really be complicated. And I think the inequities that exist in our system, it's an interesting concept. When I said it was kind of the antithesis of neglect, it kind of is, right? Because in many times when someone is not getting the care that their child needs, that's really at the other end of the spectrum. But I think that the inequities that exist honestly create structures and systems where things like medical child abuse can be under the radar for a much longer period of time because assumptions are made about the people that are seeking that care. So Gina, I just want to acknowledge that it really, I learned so much from this group in so many ways. And that was one thing that I hadn't even thought about or been aware of, and certainly something I'm going to take back to my healthcare community as we think about this work.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy and Gina. Any other kind of, again, comments as it relates to where we're landing with this directive and recommendation, but also as we just capture the conversation at large? Any other comments or thoughts from folks? It seems generally like people don't have any sort of, they're like, yes, that makes sense here as to scope and not is that seems the head nods. Okay. Well, I'll wait just a minute. I just want to make sure I'm not cutting anybody off. Okay. All right, Kathy, you did such an amazing job that everybody's like, okay, whatever you say. So thank you for that. Okay, again, when we move to final votes on things, folks will have an opportunity to do final vote on these recommendations and to give comments if you were to vote not in support. So we will save that for when we move to official voting. All right, well, I'm going to just move us on to the final piece here, unless I'm forgetting something else, or Jordan, you're wanting to circling. Sorry to pick on you so much today. Okay, which is just this this survey that we sent out around the language piece, because we were just kind of in a stuck spot and we wanted to get clear. So I just want to share the results from that, which I think is just a quick share out, just so that you all understand where we landed. We did receive 21 responses, so a couple of you snuck in after this morning, which is great. So again, mandatory task force recommends amending statute to clarify that mandatory reporters who are employed by an agent of or a contractor for an attorney who is, and this is what we're wondering, is legal representation or legal services are exempt from the reporting requirements. We did land on a majority for legal services. So that is what we will be moving forward with as it relates to the draft of this recommendation. All right. And thanks to those of you that were able to participate in that. And again, if anybody does after today's meeting jump in, we will keep that open, but that's where we're at as of today. Okay, cool. Well, with that, I think we got where we needed to go, and I'm really glad that we had this additional meeting scheduled, and y'all are just crushing it as a group. I just really am so glad and thankful that we have so many folks that are dedicated to this, because it is really hard to keep people at the table for almost 2 years around such complex topics. And so just want to give a lot of gratitude for you to continue to show up, particularly when we have these back-to-back and kind of close together meetings. So really, really thank you for that. With that said, I think, Stephanie, I'm looking at you. Is there any closing business before we give some folks some time back?
No, no, thank you, everybody, and just have a good day.
Great. All right. Thanks, y'all, for a great discussion. We'll be following up via email, and we'll see you at the next meeting. All right. Take care.